Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about, well, books and stuff, and even some little Malazan for, the first time in a long while. And this is something that I wanted to talk about for a bit, and I feel inspired today, so let's talk about influences, Star Trek, the culture, Malazan, and Rejoice. I know that's a lot, but there you go. And yeah, before we go, I want to thank one of my Patreons, and that's my first Patreon ever, and that is Iskar Jarak from his YouTube channel. If you haven't subscribed to him, do that now. Anyway, thanks for still sticking with me, man. Cheers, my friend. Yeah. If you want a personal cheers, well, there's a Patreon. If you don't want a personal cheers, you don't have to actually do that. But I would very much appreciate it. Anyway, let's look into what I'm going to do here. Please be aware this will contain spoilers for the Malazan Book of the Fallen, all of it. Some spoilers for Rejoice by Steven Erikson. Some general spoilers for both Star Trek or, well, a little of Star Trek, and definitely the Culture series by Ian M. Banks. So that's a lot of stuff. Don't worry, it's not specific plot spoilers in most of them. It is just general things that I want to look at here. And I have a bit of a longer plan here, so bear with me while I explain what I've tried to do, and then watch me fail at doing it. So, I want to talk about cultural relativism and moral relativism and interventions international and a lot of that stuff. And I want to look at several types of media through the last, 50 years, more or less. 6 years, actually, almost. And how they reflect different positions in an ongoing argument, and how two of those can then be seen having, a conversation within the works of Steven Erikson, both the Malazan Book of the Fallen and Rejoice, because I would say there are certain changes between those two works as well. And yes, I will be talking more about Rejoice in a upcoming video, once I've actually reread it fully. But this thing had to come out today because I don't want to lose my inspiration. So, what do I actually plan to do here today? Well, as I said, I want to look at the ideas of cultural relativism, moral relativism, and interventions, or the justification for interventions, and how they are portrayed in Star Trek, mostly original Star Trek, and how they are portrayed or influence or play a role in the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, and then look at how that reflects in the voice of Steven Erikson, who has, well, made more or less public nods to both worlds or series, if you want to call them series, in the past. So we know that he's aware of them, which is rare with Mr. Erikson and big, IPs and stuff. But, there we are. And I think it can be enlightening because there is a larger point to that at the end. So let's start. What's cultural relativism? What's moral relativism? Why is there a problem? All right, cultural relativism is a theory, if you may call it a theory, or a concept within anthropology mostly. And the basics behind it are very simple. And I'm not going to go into like a full-on debate because I'm not qualified to do that. But basically it's like cultures are different and we can't just all judge them from the same vantage point. Now, those of you who have looked into like the wonders of post-colonial theory and all of these things will very much understand. It's like we can't go around the world and judge every single culture by our, in my case, very Western European standards, because people act within the confines of their culture, within the constraints, the history, all of that stuff of their culture. That seems on the surface to be a fairly, accessible idea. And you're like, yeah, of course, people be different, and it's the culture, not their shape of skulls, which, bad science in the 19th century would have said. So beyond that, we accept, yes, people do behave differently because of where they are. And that's fine, and you can then use that to say, so if we want to study a specific group of people, we need to accept, find ways to approach their view of viewing the world, their way of viewing the world, and so forth. That's just in academic conversations, and that's all fine. Now, where does the problem with the moral relativism come into that, you may ask? Why isn't it obvious? If people act in specific ways because of their cultural backgrounds and confines of those cultures, how can we make moral judgments about those kind of things, about the things they do? And can we do them? Can we make those? Are there, in fact, objective moral, objective judgments out there? Can we say this is generally morally wrong? This is evil. This is good. Is that stuff absolute or not? Are there moral absolutes? And moral relativism, if you go down that road, will say, no, you have to judge the actions of a specific group of people because of their cultural background, and stuff that we might find morally reprehensible may be fully acceptable there. And why is that a problem? Well, one very practical example is obviously the Declaration of Human Rights, of general human rights in the aftermath of that thing us Germans did, World War II. And you have a Declaration of Human Rights, and you're like, we declare that that's for all humans, and these are human rights. And yeah, what do we do with people whose culture does oppose some of those? How do we formulate that? That's a very, very specific, concrete point where suddenly you're not talking about how do I go and study these people, but what kind of judgments can I make, and what kind of, consequences on a global scale, in a global universe, in a global society, will follow from that. And it's an ongoing debate that is still open. So we're not done with this, and this is part of my point. Now, obviously, the practical political continuation of that debate of moral relativism or moral absolutes is obviously, if we accept there are certain absolutes, does that give us not only the right but the duty to intervene if we see some of those things actually, punished, or not punished, if we see some of those objective rules broken? In fact, do we have not only the moral right, but the moral duty to go into Germany and, take down all those Nazis to free people from concentration camps? Now, obviously the answer is yes. Or is it? And that's the question of intervention, because while it may be a clear-cut case in, something as brutal as the Holocaust, there may be other situations where that is not the case. Now you have an ongoing continuum where you need to discuss these kind of things. And it's obviously something that has changed over time. Views have changed over time. So this is sort of where we go to Star Trek, the culture, and Malazan. Let's start with Star Trek. Star Trek is still very much in the aftermath of World War II and the slowly rising new social order. There's Cold War stuff in there. There's a lot of stuff going in there. And Star Trek is, at its heart, the original story, is very political. It's fairly overtly political in a lot of ways. And that's good. So we need to talk about the Prime Directive and the idea of non-involvement. It's constantly broken by Star Trek, right? A lot of times it's this is an alien planet. We're not supposed to do anything there. We were not supposed to meddle because the rules forbid that. And then Kirk goes down and beats up someone and more or less consensually, sometimes non-consensually, sleeps with a lot of alien females. Sort of. I'm very much simplifying it, but the idea is that a lot of Star Trek stories is built on the idea we have to break those general rules of non-involvement in order to do something higher. We have to do an intervention, even if that means breaking the rules, getting, reprimanded afterwards, because we're doing the moral good here. Sort of. It's very much that whole, we did not actually fight back against the big tragedy of the Holocaust early enough, and we should have done that earlier. That sort of thing plays in the background. And at the same time, you have, other interventions that the US are already in. They are oftentimes justified with all kinds of absolutes, moral absolutes there. And that's sort of the state that we have in Star Trek. The overall rule is to don't meddle, to don't get involved, but individual cases are where we actually break those rules to do the moral good, sort of. Once again, I'm very much simplifying here, and I'm sure you can find all kinds of episodes of Star Trek where it goes differently. I'm looking at a broader trend here, and you can see the same still happening sort of in Next Generation. Also, I haven't watched a lot of Star Trek recently, so this is, once again, me very broadly generalizing here. So, what happens now when we actually move on to the culture, which is something of a response to that, I would say. Now, the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, of blessed memory, is a series of 10, more or less 10 novels. It's 9 and a collection of short stories, and it's, a bit more complicated, but it's a wonderful series of science fiction novels that y'all should go out and read, because they're absolutely fantastic in a lot of ways and do fantastic things with science fiction during a time when there wasn't really that much happening with like big galaxy-spanning sci-fi the way it has been, come back somewhat. And they are sort of published between they start being published in 1987 and move on into the 2000s until the sad and way too early death of Ian M. Banks, with the last one being the Hydrogen Sonata. And I keep forgetting when it was published. Now, why do I pick this one? Well, it has the culture, which is this human, transhuman, whatever you want to call it, galaxy-spanning society where people live in more or less happiness and so forth. And it's a bit of a utopia, and it does have all kinds of consequences that we're not going to go into here. What I'm going to look at here is the idea of how the culture does interact with other civilizations. Mostly civilizations that are not yet on the same technological and whatnot level as the culture. And it has within the culture, it does have those organizations called contact, and within contact it does have special circumstances, which is very much deliberately meddling, guiding, intervening, and so forth in all kinds of cultures to reach, from the culture's point of view, morally beneficent outcomes. They're trying to steer societies into a direction which they consider to be morally superior, i.e. closer to them. And within the novels, that often goes horribly wrong. And that's sort of where we need to look at for today. Because what the culture does is, it's a post-colonial context. And a context of interventions in our world gone wrong as well. In, places like, the Middle East, South America, and so forth. Western interventions that have oftentimes been committed, have oftentimes been done with the idea of having moral superiority, have often had terrible consequences. And that's sort of what we see within the culture. The culture does, more or less by definition, have moral superiority. They are a post-scarcity, ultra-liberal society where everyone can do exactly what they want to do and so forth. It's as I said, there's more to it, but it's fairly clear that compared to most of the societies portrayed within these conflict situations, if you want to look at, say, the freedom of the individual within the culture is always much higher than in those other cultures. But still, those interventions that, from a first glance, may seem extremely beneficial, often go horribly wrong, and thus raise the question once again, do we have the right to do that? Are there situations where we have the moral duty to go in there, the responsibility to go in and interfere with a different culture whose full context we can never actually fully understand, and fuck with them basically? And the culture's response is a more negative one than Star Trek's. It's not the full opposite because, as I said, it's a little bit complex, and Ian M. Banks was a talented writer with a lot of nuance to his text. But the overall impact of history between something produced in the 60s and something produced in the 80s and 90s is clearly visible in that regard, because it does, take a more critical stance towards interventions, and it leans closer to the moral relativism than, say, Star Trek does, even though it does, on the other hand, present a clear morally superior society with the culture, sort of. So, how do we go from there to the works of Stephen Erikson, and by which I mean Malazan and Rejoice? Because I think there's an argument there that you can see the dialogue between Star Trek and the culture repeated in a way in the works of, in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and then with a change within Rejoice. Now, what do I mean? Well, the Malazan Book of the Fallen shows a lot of different cultures, fairly elaborate cultures with very different ways of doing things, different types of societies, and, different technological stages, and all of that stuff. It's very much a microcosm. Well, not a microcosm, it's a full planet, it's a full world with all kinds of other stuff added to it, but it does have a lot of cultural variety. And it is fairly clear for the reader, or no, not very clear for the reader, but it's fairly easy for a reader, no matter which reader, to pick one society over another. It's like those guys are the good guys, more or less. And then Stephen Erikson does give us situations where it is very clear that some societies do have aspects to their cultural practice that are extremely reprehensible. And there's obviously one in Book 4, and there's one in Book 9. And if you haven't read those books yet, I will not go too much into detail. I will just say the one is about the character Bidithal, and the other one is, well, it's about the Hobbling, of course it is. You knew that. And those are instances where you can see cultural practices that are that are generally reprehensible and that should be stopped. Because while you can explain, at least in one of them clearly, in the other one it's not as detailed, how a society can arrive at that kind of practice, but there is still a fundamental need to stop certain aspects of behavior. And even in that situation, especially in Book 9 with the Hobbling, there are points where it's made clear that some members of Barghast society want to stop that specific cultural practice, move on, leave those things behind, because that's obviously clear that as societies, we have done a lot of bad shit, and as we change over time, we leave some of that stuff behind and hopefully become better. Hopefully. So these aspects are in there. And the question then is, could a culture agent actually have prevented things happening in Book 9 or would such an external influence have made things even worse? We don't know, it doesn't happen there. Because when we look at what Stephen Erikson does with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and he has formulated that himself in a wonderful quote when he was done with the whole book, he calls it his cry for empathy and compassion. And that's an important aspect, because what the Malazan Book of the Fallen does is it shows us an absolute, a tapestry of human behavior, and the goal is for us as readers to figure out what's good, what's evil, what's wrong, what's right, and how to react to it. It does not tell us what to do. There is no good guy walking in stopping things. There is no moralizing person showing up and telling us how wrong the thing was. That's the kind of thing we need to figure out for ourselves. And with some of those cultural practices, it is fairly easy to figure that out and go holy shit, that's bad. With others, not so much. But that's the way things are written in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It's a cry for help, a cry for empathy and compassion for us humans in our world. But it's up to us to react. And now we finally come to Rejoice, as the last piece of the puzzle here. Rejoice is a science fiction novel by Stephen Erikson, and I would argue a key to reading the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I'll go back to that in a future video when I've finished my reread of it, because there's a lot of connections to stuff in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. But there's a spoilers. If you haven't read it yet, well, you still should. But there's one key point I need to mention, and that is that during the events of Rejoice, an extraterrestrial superintelligence shows up and through means of technology forces humanity on our planet to get their shit together. It does do a lot more. That's, and I don't think I've actually really spoiled the plot because that part is clear fairly early on. And it's not exactly the point of the novel. But it does that. And that is sort of the end of the argument, I would say, because the end of the argument is that there are situations in which a group of people, in this case all of us as humanity, is apparently incapable of solving very apparent problems, those being mostly climate change, racism, and there's a bunch more, right? The general big ones that we are faced with every day. And apparently we're not able to fix that shit ourselves. So maybe there is a right for a almost godlike machine from out there to actually force us up there. Maybe there's like an actual, there's an imperative to do that. Maybe that actually is, warranted. And you can read into that. There's nuance there, where you, for example, have Ian Banks in interviews say that he does still believe that humanity has a chance to get, itself sorted out without a artificial intelligence taking over and being our beneficial gods that kind of keep us safe so we don't kill ourselves all the time ourselves because we tend to. Even though in his version in the culture we do have the artificial intelligences, the minds of the culture who basically steer everything already. But he's like, yeah, we still have a chance to figure that shit out ourselves. A couple of decades later, well, more or less 1.5 decades later, sort of, and after having done all the things that he has done with his Malazan Book of the Fallen, Stephen Erikson seems to be frustrated enough to say, you know what, maybe we fucked up that last chance that A&M Banks gave us, and we really need that external force in very specific cases. And the very specific case here, it's a global one. It's one that is for all of humanity. The book does not go and say these specific practices of this specific culture need to be stopped because what this other culture over there is doing is clearly better. It goes like, no, if you don't all go together and figure out how to save your planet and your species, you're fucked. We need an external force to come up, which can be read as the frustration of Stephen Erikson with the response to his book, or books in some regards, and obviously far more the response, the frustration with how the world clearly is not actually getting its shit together. And I felt that's an interesting, case study of looking at how one and the same question, a very political question, an overtly political question about how we should deal with clear problems of our day and age. Fundamental problems, how do we interact with other cultures? How do we go there? When do we have the right or duty or whatever to actually go there and tell them to stop doing something? Are there those cases or are there not? And how that through a bit more than half a century. Let's call it 60 years. 60 years, it sounds good. How that discussion has, through 60 years, been taken up by different authors in different ways, all connected to the time in which those authors, those people were creating their art, and has then inspired one another, and has had that dialogue continue in art, in very different ways. And it's still an ongoing dialogue because you can still go and say, no, we still will figure this shit out. You can be an optimist about humanity. You can be an even bigger optimist about humanity if you want to. That is still possible. But art, great art, and I'm including Star Trek here, does inspire us to think, to act, and to interact with it. And that's sort of what I wanted to point out with those couple of books and TV shows, and I hope you enjoyed that. And if not, you can violently disagree with me in the comments. Otherwise, you can also violently agree with me in the comments, and I'll be more than willing to discuss this further with anyone who feels they have something to say on the matter. And until then, thanks and cheers.